welcome everybody to our January bull session. We have three producers from different parts of the state that I thought would be really interesting how they winter graze and in their different climates. And so we have Bryan Mannix from Helmville and Cooper Hibbard from Cascade and Todd Barkley from Baker. So I will let them introduce themselves, but Bryan, if you want to start and go into kind of how you guys have been doing your winter grazing, how you started into it, successes, failures.
Yeah, so I'm Bryan Mannix. I'm the fifth generation back home now, working with my dad and two uncles, and I think there's 5 of my generation back working on the ranch right now. And I'd say that first off, we feed a lot of, we feed hay most of the winter still, but our winter grazing journey, it started before I was home. And that kind of started out consisted of like stockpiling some meadows, and we have some swamp ground that you can't get to until it freezes. A lot of sedges that the cows won't graze until you get snow and some colder temperatures. So they kind of started doing that and trying to push the limits there. And they killed a few cows trying to figure out where those limits and lines were at and how far you could go. So it definitely hasn't always been pretty. So they were kind of doing that. And then we started bale grazing some animals, I don't know, like 4 or 5 years ago, and kind of been using that as a tool kind of in certain areas where we feel like the soil could use some more ground cover or heavy nutrient loads, or using it in certain scenarios just for time management purposes. But it's more of a strategic tool and not like a general practice we use everywhere. And then our latest one that we've been doing is swath grazing, and we've just wrapped up our third year doing that. And David kind of was talking with one of his friends out of Colorado. And so we decided to start trying it, and it's been going very well for us. We wanted to do more acres, but with the hay prices this year, if we would have had a weather event that we couldn't get to those acres, it would have been a pretty big deal. So what we ended up doing was about 68 acres of swath grazing this year, and we did it with our replacement heifers. And this was the first time of the 3 years that we didn't supplement anything because we were too chicken to not supplement them before, even though we were testing the hay. But I'll throw some numbers at you real quick. So these are 2020 numbers of this field, and this field is like really subby, and it's very wet, so it's hard to graze like regrowth in the fall. You can kind of like barely get in there to hay it. You can just get it dried out enough to hay, and then the water table raises a lot, so it's kind of hard to manage for like that sod management. And it used to be very hummocky, and my uncle Randy did some disking, but he didn't like turn the soil over. He just cut the tops off of those big humps and then rolled it, and that was before that you couldn't hardly walk out there. So that's kind of like why we're trying this in that area, is because it's a hard piece to manage with traditional haying or grazing practices, just because it's so subby out there. So in 2020, the hay bales that we took off of that same field had like 7.9% protein in the dry matter, and 7.6 protein and 59.8 TDN, and the swaths had 7.9% protein and 58.5 TDN. So we didn't lose much on it, and we cut it a little later. So typically with that piece would get hayed like mid-July, and we cut it about the 10th or 12th of August, and then just raked it the same day that we cut it, and then just left it. And that first year it got rained on a lot, and we were pretty nervous about how the quality would turn out, but it turned out pretty well. And then this year I tried to put some value on it of it, if you would have hayed and baled that same acres, what would that look like? So this is just accounting for the back end, not the front end of like baling it, hauling it, feeding it back out and stuff like that. This is just what it would cost me to feed those animals with a tractor in a spinner, unrolling hay or moving poly wire. So if the same 68 acres, we would have got about 40 days of feed. And with the swath grazing, I had about 36 days of feed. And it cost me about $8.33 a day to move poly wire. And it would have cost me about $112 a day to use a tractor to feed them. So there's some significant value there. They don't get all of the swath for sure, and it does set back the grass a little bit in the spring. You can see where those old rows were, and there's some swales where like the swaths got completely iced over. But other than that, they clean it up pretty darn well, and they did well on it. I was pretty surprised at how well those heifers did on it this year. I was looking at them when they were going in, and I thought they were like a body condition score of like 5.5. And I actually think they gained about a half body condition score coming out. And even if I was wrong about that and was getting fooled by their hair coat, they didn't lose weight and they didn't get supplemented. And it was a lot cheaper to swath graze them. One thing that I learned from Cooper with him and his winter grazing program was if you see a storm coming, feed them on the front end. So 2 years ago, we had a pretty big northeaster coming and pulled the cows out and bale grazed them for like 3 or 4 days to let that storm pass. So some of those mistakes I was able to try to avoid just by learning from other people doing that, because the area that they're in is really prone to high wind, not a lot of cover. So if there is going to be a big storm, we have to find some brush for them and then feed them. So you're constantly watching the weather like most people are anyway. But one of the biggest benefits for us, like why swath graze versus just stockpile it, is we get quite not like crazy amount of snow that they can't graze through, but we get crust. We get heavy crust layers, and not just like a crust layer, but it'll actually be like an ice shelf. So we had to leave probably 80 acres of stockpiled forage this year that we couldn't get to when the weather turned on us. And you don't know if that's going to happen in December or if it'll happen in February. Like last year, we were able to graze some of our stockpiled all the way through January. And then those cows went on to those swaths till middle of March. This year, winter showed up in December and things got crusty and started getting a little ice shelf on that. The grasses that are out there is just like a lot of wild timothy and foxtail, stuff like that doesn't stand up very good through the snow. It just lays over. So it creates a really tough condition. And those swaths, they'll break that crust layer walking over it, and the ones behind them will just start to find those swaths, and they'll just walk right down and flip those swaths over with their noses. It's pretty fun to watch. I mean, I watched them graze through like a 3-foot drift, getting into it like they're all the way up to their ears was covered in the snow, sticking down and pulling out grass. So that crust really isn't as big of a factor with those swaths. And I actually kind of think they might create a little bit of heat, because last year I was walking across, putting out some poly wire, and anywhere there wasn't a windrow, I was walking on top of the snow. And anywhere that there was a windrow, I would fall through. So that crust layer was a lot thinner wherever those swaths were. But the bottom of it will freeze, and so you lose some of that forage to that for sure. So there's some downsides there and setting it back in the spring. But for us, it's been a great way for us to reduce how much we spend getting those through some of these tougher months and colder weather. I guess the only other things I'd add is I was doing them on 3-day grazes this year. Last year I had them on 2-day grazes, and a couple of the other benefits that I've seen that like you'll hear people talk about with bale grazing is how they act on a day-to-day basis. Both this year and last year, I was feeding a different group right next to them, and the ones that were on the swath grazes didn't even lift up their head at all. They were just kept going and grazing. So they were way less antsy. They're full a lot. And I was just doing the 3 days for time management this year. But I think you could get them to clean up more of the swath on like a daily move or a 2-day move than a 3-day move, just like grazing other things too.
Todd, do you want to go ahead and explain your winter grazing strategy and where you're from?
All right. So I'm Todd Barkley. We farm and ranch in eastern Montana, south of Baker, southwest of Baker. And we do a combination, I guess, of winter grazing. In amongst our cropland, we have stockpiled hay or grass. It's generally in woody draws, waterways, fences. And we put up about 800 acres of Roundup Ready alfalfa, straight alfalfa, and about the same grass alfalfa hay mix. So we'll start supplementing our alfalfa to our cattle the middle of October, and we'll do a 72-hour thing at about 5 pounds a day. So we'll feed 15 pounds every third day, and that'll get us to weaning, which is about the middle of December. And by feeding early like that on the cow, we can get our calves sort of used to how they're going to do on their weaning, because our herd is mostly a forage based herd all the time. Even though we do farm, the farming side of it is a commodity sale. So we'll do that after we wean. The cows basically winter graze until Christmas time. And at that point, they'll go into our winter pastures, into a lot of the stubble aftermath, and we'll start our protocols, which a lot of times we'll start out with just that 5 or 7 pounds of alfalfa, depending on the temperature, a day, or on that every third day feeding. And we'll gradually work into, when they start getting some of the cream off of the winter graze, we'll start adding some supplement grass alfalfa mix or a millet hay or a sorghum hay, depending on where we're at. We try not to ever feed a tame grass, perennial grass on native ground. If we're going to do that, we'll use our straight Roundup Ready alfalfa on the native, or some annual immature wheat hay. I mean, we'd like to try to put our wheat, our grain hay up in the milk stage, or the millet. So some of the things we'll do is, this year we're having to feed a full feed on our younger cows. We wean our replacement, have our yearlings off for about 4 or 5 days, and then we'll actually take them to a group of cows that had steer calves on them, for instance. So they've been weaned off and dried up, and our heifer calves go right into that cow herd, or they'll go in with our first calf heifers and younger cows, something that needs a growing ration, but they get treated the same as our cows. And we'll feed clear through the middle of May. And the closer we get to calving, the higher percentage of feed we gotta feed them. They'll be up to 100% hay by the time we're calving. And when we do that, we still feed every 7 days, and it's our poor quality hay. We keep all of our good hay through the winter, and our poor quality hay, grass alfalfa mix, 2-3-year-old hay, comes at calving time. We don't want our cows over milking, and we're rolling those bales out instead of bale grazing, because we don't want some of them hourglass bales to tip over on baby calves. And yeah, so we're up to the 2.5% body weight. And then by the 15th of May, they're pretty much out on grass. Some of the things that I'm interested in is recycling the carbon. And so we have a lot of gumbo hardpan in our area. And so when we're doing bale grazing out on that native ground, we're using either straight alfalfa or the millet or the immature grain hay. And we're bale grazing on those spots, trying to create that microclimate to stimulate the latent seed bank that's there, and getting those bare spots to start cycling carbon. And we've had some just amazing results in 1 year. So we have shale outcroppings. We do that on the shale outcroppings too. We do some strip grazing. We got some pictures. Holly will maybe show through the examples. We do some strip grazing also. We don't do the electric fence on the strip graze. There's a spot where we're bale grazing on some gumbo. That's actually on my son's piece of property. Those were 70 bales of alfalfa and clover, new seeding that had 2.5 inches of rain on it. And so we actually had 250 cows in that pasture on that particular amount of bales for about a month. And as you can see, there's pretty good grass around too. So, I mean, they'd work on those bales, and then than eat grass for sure. But yeah, and it was dry last year, so we didn't get the results that we have had in the past. But Holly, do you have some? That's my yearling heifers strip grazing. That's more than. So there's a spot on hard pan gumbo. If you look in the forefront of that picture, you'll see where we didn't get our bale grazing, but that strip that runs through that hard pan, that's just in 1 year. I think if you go to another slide, another picture, Holly, okay, there again, we haven't really addressed that on the front end, but on the back end we have. Is there a picture? Yeah, there we go. So that was this spring. I bale grazed there. That's bale grazing too. That's not me rolling bales out. So it's like everything. It's a technique. All of our winter feeding is a technique, and you can get good at it, but it is a technique. So it takes some trial and error and some doing things. And as you can see in that picture, there's not a lot of quote unquote waste. And what is there is creating a microclimate in that hard pan gumbo to stimulate the latent seed bank. Most everything that's coming up in there is seeds that have come in through either the jet stream or wind or cattle or livestock, because straight alfalfa, Roundup ready, no weeds coming in, or immature grain hay that doesn't have weeds. So yeah, so we're pretty excited about that in our winter program. There's some stalkers bale grazing out on some pasture. The ones on the back are eating the bales that I put out. That last picture was some yearlings that were probably on something I'd done 3 weeks ago. And I was talking to my son about this because he's having an extra amount of weight, but this is all part of the technique. But these cattle will come back to these sites and as long as we've been doing it, it seems like 3 weeks is the key. They'll come back and revisit those spots that they'd stepped in and messed in and all that other stuff. But a couple things I guess we really pay attention to is the nutrients requirements of the cow. We don't like to overfeed, but they do need their daily allowance of protein. Protein's the one we focus on the most. We've had a couple issues with the vitamin A in the spring, and this is going to be another one of those years. So if out of any of this, what I can just stress and not stress enough is if you're not calving with nature, which we're not. I mean, we calve the middle of April, not the middle of May. There's not going to be enough vitamin A in a lot of this hay that we're feeding this year, and a lot of this grain hay that we're feeding, even though there's not enough nitrates to create problems. Nitrates tie vitamin A up. Grain hay has no vitamin A. So please, because we've had 2 big wrecks with vitamin A. Once was feeding 2 and 3 year old hay, and once was feeding really, really green grain hay, and it cost us pretty dearly. But anyways, with that, I guess we don't do the electric fencing in the wintertime, but I just want to give you an example of how because they talk about mob grazing, and every time I feed a bale of hay, I go out there, yes, meeting the nutrient requirements of my cow, but I also want to have a secondary deal of what can I do to benefit my ground with this bale of hay. And so if you go to some of these mob grazing workshops and they're talking this 1 million pounds of cows per acre and stuff, when we put out our alfalfa every 3rd day, we roll it out because we cannot bale graze. We cannot set that few bales out with the number of cows and everybody get their 5 pounds a day or their 15 pounds. So when I take the 2 bales out or 3 bales out, I'll find that hot spot, or I'll find a spot next to some hard pan gumbo or whatever I want to treat, and I'll roll that bale out, and say I roll it out for 200 feet, and that's 2 cows eating side by side is 24 feet. So that's a rod and a half. And say I get 200 feet rolled out, right? So that's 4,800, square feet, and the acre is 42,000 square feet. So that's basically 1/8.8 of an acre. And if I did my math right, which I hope I did, if there was 150 cows on that 200 foot of alfalfa hay, that's basically 180,000 pounds if they're 1,200 pound cows times the 8.8. So I got 1,584,000 pounds per acre on that 200 foot. And they're only going to be on there 20 minutes, which That's about all you want on if you have that kind of stocking rate. So you can address that hot spot without any electric fence or anything, just by rolling out some alfalfa or some out on some hot spots or some issues you want to address. So that's how we sort of take our winter feeding. You know, I guess soil health is the big buzzword now, and we've been doing it for 20 years, and we're only in a 10-inch rainfall area, and they usually come in 3 or 4 huge events. And the more we can stimulate the water holding capacity of our soils, the better off we are. So, and if you have any questions, feel free to call, but I guess that's all I have for now.
Thank you, Todd. We appreciate it. Cooper, do you want to go next?
Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Cooper Hibbard. I'm excited to be visiting with you all tonight. I wasn't nervous until I see that my brother's on the call, and all of a sudden I got really nervous. So it must be his intimidating facial hair or something. So if I seem nervous, it's definitely Terrell's fault. But so like Bryan, we're also a 5th generation family ranch, my brother and myself being part of the 5th generation. And we're located outside of Cascade, Montana, and a fairly mountainous environment. It's tough for us to put up a lot. We range from about 43,000 to about 7,800 feet in elevation. And so the ranch has 3 different zones. We have our winter zone and our what we call our shoulder zone or our transition zone, and then our summer grazing zone, our summer country. And our winter zone and our ability to produce hay is definitely the bottleneck for us and what drives and dictates what our stocking rate is. And we were historically, it was just a conventional ranch. We're running cattle and sheep, and we're calving in February and March. And because of that setup where winter grazing zone or winter zone was the true bottleneck, it just kind of felt like we're trying to put a square peg in a round hole. It just didn't work. And so 20 years ago, we changed our calving date to what ended up being June 1st. It's been June 10th. We just changed it to June 1st. And that allowed us to, by doing that, we matched our cow's production cycle with the grass cycle. And we did that in hopes of getting away from feeding hay and having to really be dictated by the area of our winter zone of how many cows we could run year round. And by doing that, we started winter grazing. So we started winter grazing 20 years ago because our cows were in their 2nd and 3rd trimester throughout the winter. And so I came back home about 9 years ago. And so 20 years ago, when we winter grazed, they're on about 7-day moves. And then when I came home, we were on about 4.5-day moves on an average move. And we're currently on 1-day moves. And so in that progression from 4.5-day moves since I came home to currently being 1-day moves, we've increased our productivity and harvest efficiency in that winter zone by 200%. So what that means is that winter zone, which was the bottleneck for our productivity as a ranch, for how many cows we could run, we just got handed 2 more winter zones just by changing our grazing management. Well, it's not as simple as that. First, we changed our production cycle, and then we changed our grazing management. But what we've learned through that process and through that progression was just a series of mistakes and a lot of trial and error to see what works for this place and in this environment, and our resources, our workforce, and just kind of how the logistics of everything work and fall together here. I think those principles still apply, even if you are calving in April or March. And what we've learned through those principles, or how we've gotten to that increase, the average increase of 200%, is on those one day moves. I'm a big believer in non-selective grazing when possible. And the beauty of non-selective grazing is every single plant's affected. And when every plant's affected, it's either grazed or trampled. When every plant's affected, it's put on a level playing field. And in that scenario, the plants that succeed and win, the plants you're setting up for success, are the plants with the deepest root systems and the most amount of leaf area. And those, more often than not, are your desirable species. And so not only are you selecting for your desirable species through that grazing event, you're also increasing your grazing efficiency because you're affecting every plant, right? Your cows are eating more plants than they would otherwise. And you're also, a byproduct of non-selective grazing is litter. So you're laying down more litter, you're covering more soil. So you're building soil, you're capturing more water, you're extending your growing season because you're cooling your soil temperatures. And all of that leads to this 200% increase on average. And that 200% increase happened in 5 years. And those 5 years were some of the driest years that this ranch has ever seen. And there's a real kind of stigma with that type of grazing that it's really pretty difficult with animal performance, and it is. But the understanding is it's kind of this real tension between whatever gains you get in ecological benefits, you have to give up in animal performance. I think that there's a way to break through that. And it seems like we have broken through that. And this is where it gets really pretty technical and where these principles are really important. I think that that at least helped guide our day. And we've come by these honestly through a series of very expensive mistakes. But if we make a point of moving our cows on these one-day moves, we move our cows when they're full. And what happens when you move them when they're full, it seems like you can affect, with that mob grazing and there's that real competitive mob mentality type behavior that these cattle get where they're just this real frenzy, and I've seen that and I've felt it, and it's really frustrating. And all of a sudden you're not in control anymore and your cows are angry and not happy and stressed out, and who knows what that compiling stress does to their performance. And that certainly happens and starts to build if you show up and you move them when they already know that it's time to be moved and they're waiting for you. And so we started moving them when they're full. And that same competitive mindset that these cows had ended up forcing them, we're basically force feeding them. It's forcing them to eat when they otherwise wouldn't, because they want to get that piece of grass before that other cow does. And for those of you who are familiar with Johann Zeitzman, one of his big genetic selection criteria is high relative intake, which is the more feed that a cow can eat in relation to her body size is one of the largest indicators for whether or not she'll be in good condition in respect to her peer, right? Well, I think that you can do that with your management as well. You can influence their relative intake. You can make them eat more per their individual body size than they otherwise would by moving them when they're full and utilizing that mob competitive mentality as a tool in your favor. And by doing that this last year, so we start winter grazing around December 15th. They'll be on daily moves, and we'll have them on daily moves until about May 15th. And so from December until it was late April, Rick Coughlin, who's on the call, has been working with us for the last 11 years. And Rick came in December and he came in May. And in December, our cows were body condition 5. And throughout the winter, they didn't see any supplement. We fed them 200 pounds per cow to get them through the polar vortex and just mineral and salt. And they're on these daily moves. And by late April, they're body condition 5 3/4. So we gained 3/4 of body condition, or 75 pounds throughout the course of the winter without any supplement and 200 pounds of hay. Keep in mind, though, that these girls were in their second and third trimesters, so it's a different ball game. But with that type of focus on our day, with really paying attention to animal behavior, getting our eye dialed in to the grazes and when they're full and when it was time to move them, after walking that line between we've grazed this as effectively as we see fit and they're still full and ruminating, let's move them. Dave, who is in charge of this area of the ranch, he just really got that dialed in this last year. And that's been kind of the little secret that we've been waiting to find for 2 decades. And Bryan also mentioned that it took me years to figure this out, because it's like once you get sucked into this winter grazing mindset, you really kind of you get to be pretty conservative with your resources. You just don't go out feeding hay willy-nilly because you can see what you can do. And so I was of the mindset when these storms would hit where it's like, oh, let's just wait and see. Let's wait and see how bad it is. And let's wait and see if we actually need to feed them. And so we made a point of well, I really messed up many times by doing that. That was not the right move and was really expensive and cost us in body condition that we were not able to gain back throughout the rest of the winter. And so we started feeding on the front end of storms. So like feeding half ration even a day before the storm hits and just keeping that furnace going. And that's been a big change. It's helped us conserve body condition, because I'm really of the philosophy that everything, when you boil it all down, everything, fertility, calf health, cow longevity, the efficiency of your ability to use your resources and ability to graze as efficiently as you think you need to graze, and supplementing as least as you think you need to supplement. It all comes down to body condition. So how you can build up body condition when Mother Nature provides it, and conserve it for the rest of the year that's in my current thinking anyways, that's what it all comes down to. So I think I'll end it there. Well, the other thing I would say is, in the progression of the 4.5 day graze periods to the 1 day graze periods, that was just trial and error. And, we're going out and checking these cows typically every day anyways. And so spending an hour to do polywire work while we're out there actually seems like it's less work than a 3 day graze, and certainly better for the cows than a 2 day graze, because the power of seeing fresh feed every day really does wonders, I think, for these girls, especially when they're moved, when they're full. And so it's kind of these 1 day moves for us in our environment is just a win-win-win across the board. I think that's about sums it up for me, Holly.
Thank you, Cooper. Trisha has a question. Do you want to ask that, Trisha, or do you want me just to ask it for you?
That was actually PJ, so I'll let him ask one to know there from Bryan. When you swath that hay down in the fall or whatever you said, August or September, between then and when the cows graze, did you ever have any trouble with the wind blowing your windrows away?
I did have one little cyclone go through and mess up a few windrows. Kind of pissed me off, but overall not too much, because I think you're raking it when it's green, so it's a lot heavier than what you would typically think of a windrow looking like. It's pretty heavy, but I have seen one time I had a little cyclone go through, and it wasn't a very big area, but messed a few of them up.
Todd, can you add to that, being that you're kind of on the plains, right? Does the wind wreak havoc on yours?
So really important when you swath that to rake it. Down where we're at, the swath grazing that you see my heifers grazing on there was probably a ton to the quarter to the acre hay, which is, pretty good for us. And that was a big hay year. And I was just tired of doing bales. And I thought this will be perfect. It's in a winter pasture where a lot of times I'll kick my yearling heifers and bred heifers and maybe some short-term cows, because I truly am a believer that cows are your cheapest hired hands when it comes to taking care of heifer calves. I mean, adult supervision. But anyways, so yeah, it's really important to rake that when it's wet. When it's heavy, you'll rake it together and it'll settle down and form a nice wind shielding windrow. And we have 50, 60 mile an hour winds in the wide open. And on that particular year, there was 180 acres, I think we did that year, and we had no problem whatsoever with the wind. No. So, and that was July, and that was year before last. And that particular hay had probably 18 inches of rain from the middle of July to the end of September. I don't know, Rick, you can remember that. You guys came down for a tour on the creek on our burdock, but we had rain that year. And, that sort of settled those windrows down a little bit, and they look awfully black, but the heifers thought they were candy. I should have probably taken a feed sample, quality sample of it as far as the nutritional value, but everything you read on it just says it locks in that protein, locks in that nitrogen or protein, all of that stuff gets locked in. And with all this Roundup or with this alfalfa that we're putting up, it's the same way. I would just as soon have an immature alfalfa plant that has 4 inches of rain on it than one that gets a lot of rain on it, or a mature plant that has had no rain on it. I mean, just by cutting that plant at that stage of growth locks in those nutrient values. So yeah, but rake it when it's wet. Don't rake it when it's dry. You want that windrow to settle together. So that's what I can add to that.
Okay, Seth, do you want to ask your dad a question? I'm sure he'll appreciate this one.
Okay, would you ever go back to conventional winter grazing, feeding every day, and why?
No, never, ever. So growing up, our place was pretty small, and my dad was outside employment. And so we'd do chores, and every day he'd come home in the afternoon and I'd be done with school and we'd go out and do chores. And we'd get there and the cows would be waiting at the gate. It'd take 2 people or else the cows are in the hay yard. Then I come home from college, needed to figure ways to sort of work myself in and save money, this, that, and the other thing. Went to Ann Fisher, put on a seminar in Baker with Neil Dennis from Canada. And not only with his grazing techniques, but also his winter techniques. And I started from there. And that's when Seth was young. He's 25 on his own ranch now by Sentinel Butte. We're really proud of him for that. He's starting to second guess some of the things his dad's been doing, which I'm not real proud of that, but he's his own person now. But anyways, the kids were young. By doing some bale grazing and some of these other techniques, we were just able to enjoy our family, go on week-long or weekend trips without having to worry about the cows. So no, other than the benefit economic, it was a huge benefit to our family life too. And another thing about the economic side, I guess liars figure and figures lie, but one thing that you just cannot argue about with some of these alternative wintering techniques is it is just absolutely beneficial to soil health. Period. Absolutely no discussion otherwise on that, in my opinion. And it's not even opinion, it's a fact. So thanks, Seth, for that question.
Okay, Rick, do you want to ask Cooper your question?
Hey, Cooper, tell us about how many cows are in the mob that you move every day. What's the cow per acre density? And maybe talk a little bit about how you deal with water and what percentage of the grass, the winter grass that they're on, that you try and leave behind in a move. Thanks.
Great to hear you, Rick. So historically, the mob that we've been dealing with, and when I say the mob, for us in the wintertime, it's our coming 4-year-olds and up. Our coming 2 and coming 3-year-olds, we have them full feed, as well as our heifer calves and all of our other calves. So it's just our coming 4-year-olds and up. We have them. That's our mob. And historically, that's been a group of about 1,000 head. And right now it's 1,200 head. And the feed is 2/3 of last year anyways, as of right now. And so it's 1,200 head on 24 acres has been about the average. But yesterday was an 8-acre graze because they're in some pretty thick stuff. And that 8-acre graze would have meant, so that's 150 cows an acre for a day. Also 150 CDAs is the metric that we use for calculating amount of forage that's harvested, the volume that's harvested. CDAs, ADAs, SDAs, cow days per acre is what that stands for. And we'll be getting into feed that's of that similar volume here for the next month and a half. So I think our paddock sizes will probably fluctuate between 8 and 15 acres. And then moving away from water. So most all of this is with polywire that we use, a single strand temporary polywire. The best polywire that the one that we like the most anyways, is a Gallagher turbo wire. Some of the stuff that we bought 20 years ago, we still have, whereas some of these other brands that we've tried just don't even begin to hold up compared to the Gallagher turbo wire. And then we get like the 3/8" fiberglass posts that are just not the pigtail stuff with the step in. It's just one post that's pointed on one end. We get caps and pound those in, and we don't bother with the clips or anything. We just do a single wrap or a half hitch around those posts as we go along. And those posts will be every 20 to 25 paces, but they'll have to fluctuate with the terrain. And if you have your water point, we'll build out our grazes away from water. So currently the mob, let's say the water point's right where pointing on my chest here. And they're currently in a paddock, a permanent pasture that is a long rectangle. And so all we're doing is just building these temporary break fences moving away from water. And to give access to fresh feed every morning, we just go out and we build the next break fence. We see how they utilize that ground. We can recalculate the size the paddock needs to be. We'll build the next break fence. We'll roll up the first break fence to give them access to fresh feed. Either that or we'll just open the gate, and we like to have them go by us in the gate. That's how we fence line wean all of our calves in the fall. And so that's how we train our cows for fence line weaning. We start training them now, getting them to go by us in a gate and be comfortable with that and trust us. And I think those were all your questions. Rick, let me know if I didn't cover them.
How much grass do you leave behind? What percent do you kind of shoot for?
I don't really shoot for a percent, and I don't shoot for a stubble height either. You know is better than me what percentage we leave behind, because I'm just not used to looking at it with that lens. Really what we are looking for is, first off, we don't want our cows to be hungry and we don't want to be pushing them too hard. It's animal performance first. Second is trying to get them to affect as many plants as possible, if not every single plant. And once we strike that balance, then it's time to move. So that's more the lens that I'm looking through. You know, when I first came home, what we were shooting for was a 4-inch stubble height. I don't think that exists. I don't think you can get a 4-inch stubble height. Some plants are going to be grazed down. Your best plants are going to be grazed down to the dirt. And then other plants that they don't really like are going to be 8 inches tall. And that still kind of happens in a non-selective grazing, but less so. There's more animal impact in a non-selective grazing scenario. And that also highlights why non-selective grazing is important, because in a more selective grazing scenario, if you don't provide adequate rest, you're selecting for your undesirable species to outcompete, because your desirable species are the ones that will be grubbed down to the dirt, and your undesirables will be the ones that aren't touched. Those are the ones that'll go to seed. Those are the ones that'll shade everything else out, and they just have a leg up in that scenario. So what percentage, Rick, would you say that we leave behind from what you've seen?
30 to 40. How often do you come back?
Thank you for asking that. I don't highlight that enough. So this feed is stockpiled all year. We're only in the winter zone from about December 15th to May 15th. And our growing season might start end of April, certainly by the first week of May. And so wherever we are during the growing season, we won't go back to that spot during the growing season for it'd have 2 growing season rests. That doesn't mean that we don't go back there the next year. We go back there the next year and graze it again during the dormant season, but we won't be on that ground during the growing season until 3 years from then.
Andrew, I think he answered your question, but so I didn't know if you had another one, or we can
Well,
just.
maybe I just add a little bit more real quick. Yeah, Cooper, thanks. You've already answered a lot of my question, but would you mind painting a little more of a picture? You were talking about moving your back fence away from water. So that back fence, is that connected to 2 permanent fences, like high tensile or barbed wire? And this might be, this probably varies for you, but when you're stringing up that poly wire for a 1-day graze, is that, several hundred yards long, quarter of a mile long? Can you paint a little bit of a picture of what that looks like?
Yeah. So if you remember the permanent paddock I painted in the air for you where the cows are right now, that's barbed wire on one side and permanent electric on the other. But most of the time it's strictly poly wire. So we'll build these spines out with poly moving away from water, and we'll try and build it to where we aren't, that full paddock, that spine that we build out with all the break fences that we end up putting in, that you aren't in that full paddock, definitely not longer than 10 days. 7 days is a little bit better, especially once the ground starts warming up. It just gets to be quite a bit of animal impact closer to water. So there's a lot of scenarios, Andrew, where we'll do that all temporary. I can't remember the second question that you asked. I'm sorry.
I was just trying to imagine in my mind what that back fence is. That
the width.
Long back fence. Yeah.
Yeah. So we used to make those pretty narrow, no wider than a quarter of a mile. But it seems like if your paddocks are a little bit broader, there's less trailing that happens, less trails. And so I'd say that it's between quarter of a mile to third of a mile wide. You know, sometimes it's just a couple hundred yards. It definitely does vary, but half a mile, that's getting pretty wide. I'd say quarter mile is probably about average.
Wyatt, do you want to ask Brian your question?
Yeah, it was just a quick question. I was just wondering if he has any issues with elk where they're swath grazing.
Yeah. So last year we did some, it's like on an irrigated piece, but it's like right in the middle of the elk's winter habitat. So it's like surrounded by more dry land, native stuff. And it's just, back in the day, they made some ditches. So it's actually irrigated for a little while. And we swath grazed that because we weren't going to get to it with any cows for a while. And it was a lot milder winter than this year's been. It was open in January. And I was watching about 200 head of elk, and they would just pass through it. And I don't know if that speaks to the quality of those swaths at the time. So I don't know why those elk weren't just hammering that last year, but they were just traveling through it and they weren't hammering on it. And this year we've got about close to 300 head that are in that winter range, just above the highway. And so far we have not had them come down into those swaths yet. It's kind of been an experiment going along. We also have a shoulder season in this area that allows us to apply pressure earlier and longer than the general season, which definitely helps. So it's something that we're watching but haven't had trouble with yet.
Thanks.
Anybody else have questions? Just go ahead and fire away.
The first question is for all of you. You were all pretty candid that in this process of improving your practice of doing a better job, all of it involved some pretty significant, well, maybe not, it didn't sound like so much with you, Brian, but even you had a little bit that there was a sort of inevitable period of mistake, in some cases, maybe almost pretty impactful economic mistakes. Can you just share your willingness as you went through this process? And I suspect you'll go through some more mistakes if you're anything like me. I'm much older than you guys. But how do you relate to kind of risk mitigation, knowing these experiments aren't always going to turn out, especially at the front end, the way you had hoped? And then when these mistakes do occur, how do you manage that, you know, in your business structure to accommodate the kind of losses that sometimes occur? So for all of you, I mean, basically you're doing some great stuff, but there is an economic impact in the process of learning, and I'm wondering how you guys manage that learning curve. Don't go all at once.
I can go first. That's a great question, Bill. You know, I was fortunate enough to spend some time bouncing around with Burke Teichert. In fact, he said a lot of things that have stuck with me. And in fact, one of them relates to what Todd was saying when he goes out to feed. And, you know, what Burke said was when he's loading the feed tractor, he's a nutritionist. And when he's feeding out the hay, he's a range scientist, much to Todd's point of like, you take the act of feeding as an opportunity to build soil, right? Another thing that Burke said that's really stuck with me on this point, Bill, is fail fast, fail cheap, fail forward. And so I really took that to heart when setting up these experiments. It's like, okay, I'm obsessed with trying to find out what's possible. I love talking about what's possible. I don't like talking about what's impossible. I think that's a waste of time. I don't like talking about what we can't control. Let's talk about what we can control. Let's talk about what's possible. But how do you find what's possible and not bury yourself? And I think those three, that phrase that Burke shared with me, if you can figure out how to set up experiments to find what's possible in a way where you fail fast, you fail cheap, and you fail forward, then it will be a learning experience with a small tuition. I've certainly made the mistakes that have lasted, the repercussions lasted for years. But with that, much like when you're feeding hay, how can you make that an opportunity to build soil? As painful as those mistakes were, there's always a silver lining. And some of the mistakes I made directly affected body condition, which then directly affected breed back, which then directly affected how many cows we could run, which then directly affected our bottom line and our ability to generate revenue. And so finding myself in that situation, and I pride myself on, I don't really agree with the rhetoric of there's a certain amount of pride in some circles of running a lean operation with fewer people, fewer people per cows. I really pride myself on feeding as many families as possible. And that'd be the last thing to go. So it's like, well, how do we make this sucker work? And because of that, we really got pretty creative with some marketing deals and just trying, how do we make lemonade in this situation? And got creative in ways that we wouldn't have had I not forced us into that situation through poor management. And it has served us and will be serving us into the future. But really that's my current risk mitigation strategy when approaching something where I have caution. It's like, okay, well, if this is something we want to do, how do we fail fast and fail cheap and fail forward?
I'll jump in. Sure. Yeah. So I didn't do a very good job of explaining or sharing a lot of our hardships apparently there, Bill. So I'll go down that rabbit hole a little bit right now and share one of our current wrecks that we're in. Wally Olson says, anytime that you make management changes, you're going to pay a tuition price. And I can tell you right now, I'm tired of paying tuition. So this year we moved our calving season back. So last year, 2021, our main herd was calving April 20th through June. The ones that calve in June calve on their own. And our 2-year-olds are calving in May and June. And when we made that, we were hoping that those cows could winter those calves longer and tried to utilize more of our hay that's just kind of cow quality hay, and the cow could supplement the calf. And knowing that when we go along that process, when you go to wean them is going to be made some on weather conditions, but most likely off of body condition. And so last June, we had a giant wreck of scours in our 2-year-old calves, lost a bunch. We're IVing a bunch of calves. Big learning curve there as far as that goes. And we think it had something to do with when the feed changed and how hot it got there in June. Now fast forward to this winter or this fall, we had calves and cows coming home out of the mountains with pink eye. Haven't ever seen that before. I fought pink eye all summer with stalkers. Some were bought and some were home raised. Fought that almost till we sold them. We're lucky and we're able to sell them, pretty much all of them, except for a few. And then as we go into this winter grazing with pairs, and we're like, okay, this is kind of a different beast than what we usually have done. We'll just have to really, really pay attention. And I went out one day, Dave asked me to go look at what I thought the body condition was like. I'm like, well, it's not great, but I think we can go a little longer. Well, knowing my personality, whenever I have that thought, that's probably the day that you should wean or pull them or do something, whether it's move them. If I think they can go another day, I should probably move them that day. It's just my personality is to push things to the limit. And then you find where that limit was where you had that initial thought in my head anyway. And when we were winter grazing those pairs, we started right before we pulled them off the winter grazing and started feeding those pairs. We ended up seeing a couple water bellies and don't usually see the pink eye was starting to get worse. I started seeing some pneumonia. Like the calves' health was just not great. And I don't think that they were going to water very well. And I don't think that they were probably getting enough mineral because they were probably having to compete with the cows for the mineral intake. And so currently I've got like 300 calves with pink eye that we're just battling. And I've been calling everybody that I can think of, everybody that I've heard a podcast talk about nutrition, to not just I'll do dang near anything to get out of the scenario that I'm currently in with these calves. But also I don't just want to put a Band-Aid on it. I want to find the underlying condition of why is this happening? Like, what are they lacking that their immune system is down to where they're so susceptible to these things? And some of that was from that winter grazing. I'm pretty sure of it, but not all of it, because this fall having those animals come out of the high mountain country with it was very abnormal. So, like trying to break everything down to like our whole mineral program currently. So there's a few wrecks for you. One of the learning curves was just like, we probably can't graze those swamps with pairs. So what we're looking at now is, you give up that grazing those swamps and those sedges and just go on hay sooner, or do you wean sooner? And the problem with us for weaning sooner is we don't have a lot of high quality hay. We don't really farm, so we would have to buy some more inputs to do that, or sell the calves in the fall. So those are kind of some things that we're wrestling with right now and trying to adjust as we go forward. But back to your original question of how do you economically try to mitigate those learning curves. And what I think that the brothers have done very well is placing small bets on something. And if it works, exploit it. And if it doesn't, learn from it, adjust, or don't do it again. Kind of three options you got there. But they did a really good job of like always being curious, always looking for a better way to do something, understanding their environment, and placing small bets. And then if that bet worked, exploit it. We move very slowly kind of as a family, which can be a positive and a negative on these things, but that's one of the benefits. And then the other way I'd say that we've tried to mitigate these learning curves is just diversity of where you're selling things and your income. So right now, we have some stockers. We have stockers sell calves in the fall. Although we didn't this last year, we retained everything. Then we have our grass finished beef program. And then we've sold a few calves for genetics replacement heifers, that type of stuff. So anytime like looking forward to 2022, how do we mitigate this pink eye wreck and some of these health, like if they can't go on the truck, well, if you never doctored them, they can go into your beef program. Now all of a sudden that kind of, you didn't lose a lot. In fact, you might have gained something there. But for us, I would say it's multiple sources of either markets or income, and placing small bets and trying to exploit the ones that work well.
Worst scenario, right? And I got my daughter and my son on this call, so I can't even fib, right?
The competition is on.
Yeah, right. So I mentioned before I had a couple vitamin A wrecks, and in both of those wrecks, my cows were coming into calving in a 5+5.5 body condition score. We just started, and at that time, both times we were calving in smaller pastures and pairing pairs out, a day after they were born. And once they go out, then we generally don't deal with them. And I started getting a bunch of calving issues, which we normally never have, feet down, backwards. They just weren't getting presented right. And it was my turn to bale graze out feed out in the cows that I'd kicked out. And I'm out there and I find like 10 dead calves and I'm going, what's going on? So we had some liver biopsies and it was vitamin A. And both times actually caught some sloughs the second time when we were doing the millet hay and the wheat hay prior to calving, and we run those cows in and gave them a vitamin A shot. So I've had, and each one of those cost me, not quite 10% of my calf herd before we even got into calving, right? So that was hard. I've had some choke cherries. We graze, this is summertime, but I suppose all of us do some things different in the summertime too on our summer grazing, but I graze a lot of burdock and Canada thistle in our woody draws. And a couple times we've had choke cherries cost us 11 cows overnight. One year I was grazing some failed pea crops with a lot of kochia in it. and I lost about 11 cows. And that was because of nitrates in the kochia. And I was thinking with the protein, I would open up into some tame grass pastures and balance that kochia off. And Seth was in college at that time in a feeds class, and he was bringing it up to his professor, and his professor says, them cows will get used to nitrates until you take them off it for a day. So what was happening was they were getting used to the nitrates after I'd lose one, but then I'd open them up into a pasture and they'd go in and they just lose that buildup. The choke cherry thing, this year we lost 5 cows to asthma. We got a August rain, the end of August, and we were in terrible drought. We grew more grass in August than we did all year. But anyways, we had a flush of green grass everywhere. We lose 5 or 6 cows in 2 days there. So how do you mitigate that? Well, through our winter savings on how we winter feed, and then just the increase of our carrying capacity on our ranch, right? So, you've heard a 200% increase on their winter range. We've increased our cow herd. We've downsized our cows too, but on a place that used to run 250 cows, we're running 400 mother cows plus stockers and doing some other things with the same equipment basically. So how do you mitigate what we're doing? Well, I lost 11 cows here, I lost 30 calves here, whatever, but the increase in cow numbers sort of helped mitigate that. When we were running a traditional ranch at the carrying capacity we were at, it just wasn't working, trying to raise a family. We don't have outside jobs. We started doing some of these different techniques, increasing our cow numbers. And as we were increasing our cow numbers, we were increasing our grass production. You could just see it. I don't measure things other than by eyesight. On a typical year, we're on 5 to 10 day moves. We're not on 1 day moves, but you could go to the front end of our moves and you wouldn't even think we had cows in it. And I have German short hair dogs. I like to bird hunt. We've always had habitat to bird hunt. So that's some of the mitigation that we have. Now you come to my place this year and you couldn't bird hunt anywhere. It's bad. And we were 25% open on our cows, 50% open on our heifers. We probably knew we were going to come into this wreck. We ultrasound, everything bred up in the first cycle and just very little bred up after that. So, my feeding program, I think, worked because them cows were in good enough condition to get through some of that. This country's just tough, and this is one of those tough years. But I went to a winter seminar in Miles City I was just out of college, and before Burke was the head of the Deseret Ranch, there was I'm not going to think of his name. Rick, can you think of it? Managed the Deseret ranches, and he just said,
Talking about Simon?
Yeah, there you go, Greg Simons, and he talked about fixed costs and opportunity costs, and it takes us the same amount of equipment to do 200 cows as it does to do 400 or 700 or whatever. And, pretty soon that cow herd starts paying for itself. And that's how we've mitigated our wrecks. And then another thing I'd like to say is that in all of this, and I think Bryan insinuated it, but do you do 100% of what you do at 60%, or do you do 60% what you do at 100%? And I think that's just really important to take an aspect of this and do it 100%. And if it works, when your comfort level gets into it, then just build upon that. But if we just do 100% of the things at 60%, we're probably going to fail at everything. And another thing I'd like to add on our winter of the cows is we winter a lot on snow. Even though we have a pipeline in a pasture or whatever, if we have snow, we'll make our cows lick snow for water. And we've never had a wreck on that. And we belong to an Eastern Montana Regenerative Ag Group, and we have a meeting in February. And there's a lot of young producers, Seth included in that. And they all went through this this whole drought nationwide, actually. And we are mentors in that group. And we have a lot of younger people wondering if what we're saying is actually working. And so sometimes it's hard to be a voice out there too. But I think what we're going to see in the next years in the future is going to be the reward what we've been doing the last 20 years, you know, the sustainability of it. So did that answer it at all?
Well, I thought you guys all get an A++ for honesty and candidness. It's pretty painful talking about Rex, but I mean, basically we heard the rest of the story, and I think, like always, we do these things. You know, we often get asked to be on panels because people think we're cool and they hear our cool stuff. They usually don't hear our Rex because people don't ask questions like that. And we can learn a lot more from our Rex than we can from what we do cool. And you guys did a great job. And I just hope we can leverage people's, you know, going back to Cooper's fail quick, fail cheap. Well, maybe if we get together in a circle and more often talk about who's failing the quickest and the cheapest, it might advance all of our bottom lines. So thank you very much.
Anybody else have any questions?
I have a question
Oh, good.
regarding the pink eye. Since one of the things I don't know if Cooper can address this, but one of the things that the stockmanship people talk about is daily moves, with actually more than daily moves, but actually taking animals for a walk to reduce stress can actually reduce the incidence of certain things like pink eye. I don't know if you would want to comment on that or not. I've had experience with it on a small number of animals, and it seems to make a difference, seems to benefit, but I can't talk about it on a large group.
Can I add to this too, Holly, a little bit? So we fought pink eye a little bit this year in our replacement heifers, but the year before in our entire cow herd also. So I think there's a new strain of pink eye going around. I mean, we have friends in Jordan that are fighting it now too. About 25 years ago, my father-in-law had a breakout of pink eye, and it ended up being red nose. So when we got our pink eye, we did some testing for red nose too, and it wasn't red nose. But you know, so pink eye and some of that can also be, you know, a different sign of some stuff. But 2 years ago, we tried to run our cows in one mob, our young cows, our old cows. And I just felt that I did put some extra stress on them cattle, and everything's closer at water. I normally, we brand later in June because I'm farming, and it's just how it works through our rotation. And in June, I do snap a fly tag and I pour them with sidectin. And I still have dung beetles. I think they're when it's hot in June, they're maybe hibernating too, staying out of the heat. But anyways, I decided, you know, I'm not going to snap a fly tag in them. I didn't run the cows through. I didn't sidectin them. And boy, did I have a wreck. This year, I did not want to go through that again. So I did slap a fly tag in them, and I did pour them with sidectin again in June. And like I said, we had no problems on our cows and our calves, and we did have probably 20 of our 110 yearling heifers that we were breeding have problems, and they were in a pasture in their own. And my other stock or yearlings didn't have pink eye. So I don't know. I mean, this just happens all of a sudden, and not just. I mean, we have some traditional ranchers in our area that are fighting it too. So I think there's a new strain in the air. But I guess that's what I can add to that.
So, Paul, from a stockmanship standpoint, I've certainly heard of people taking cattle with foot rot on for a walk, and that actually helping. I've seen that from trailing stuff down from our Forest Service allotment, and maybe it was just a rock stuck between their toes or whatever, or just getting the blood flow going. I haven't heard about that with pink eye, but I am a big believer in the ability of stockmanship to mitigate stress in animals. And any of these situations where we put stress into our animals, whether it's through branding or shipping or receiving or preg testing or weaning, it's incumbent upon us, if we have the know-how, to do what we can to take that stress out. And well, you know, we have 1,200 cows in a mob, and I don't think there's one with pink eye. So we're fortunate that these horror stories that you hear about haven't struck us yet, but we have been. Well, before I go down that rabbit hole, back on the stockmanship deal, we wean all of our calves, typically fence line wean if we have the feed to do it and the water to do that. And we hold all of our calves over the winter. And historically, calving in June is great. The downsides to that really comes in the fall with trying to hit your breed up when your cows are breeding in September and October to hit your breed up goals. And then, when you're dealing with a weaned calf that's 400 pounds, that's a different ball game than a calf that's 550 pounds. That rumen's still developing. They're a much more sensitive animal. And our historical doctor rate for pneumonia in our calves in the fall was 23.5%. And then I really studied, thanks to my Uncle Whit and all of his writings that he did and teachings that he put together from Bud Williams. It's all Bud Williams. It's not Uncle Whit's teachings. I really studied Bud Williams, and he's huge on exercising calves and focusing on calves' mental well-being and emotional well-being. And so our historical doctor rate was 23.5% in these calves, mostly pneumonia. And we started exercising our calves. These calves, they're depressed, they're down in the dumps. So we take them for a walk, we take them to the feed ground, we take them to water. Turns out they're super dehydrated. In fact, I think that's what a lot of pneumonia was, where these calves were just not taking themselves to water. And we still deal with that situation every year. After weaning, we got to take these calves to water, and then we take them for a run, get them to clear their lungs. And pretty soon, we're taking them for a run. They start bucking and kicking, and all of a sudden they're getting excited about life. And you show up to take them to exercise these calves, and they're like bouncing on pogo sticks. And they aren't like these depressed kids in the basement anymore. They're excited to go to soccer practice, kind of a deal. And once we started doing that, the first year our doctor rate went down to 4.7%. The next year it was 2%. And the year after that, it was it was in the 1.5% range. And that's about where we've been in that 2% range since, aside from one bad year. So I think that mental and emotional well-being and that ability to mitigate stress, because stress does happen to them, and your ability to take that out, just because when an animal's stressed, the first thing they do is they burn their mineral reserves. And that leads me to the next thing, which has been a big topic, is nutrition and minerals. We did have a big pink eye break with our steer calves 4 years ago. It ripped through our steer calves, and our steers were GAP certified. And so I was just scrambling. It's just like, man, what can we do? Are there any options aside from antibiotics? And we took swabs and all this other stuff. Fortunately, it wasn't a virus. It wasn't actual pink eye. It was a bacteria, probably because of hay getting in their eye and scratching their eye. And in that scenario, turns out, well, a guy in the crew and a friend of mine who's done this thousands of times, he says WD-40 works great. So we actually did an experiment. I hesitate saying this to so many people, but we sprayed WD-40 and in a portion of our calves' eyes. The others, we set up a control group. Some got WD-40, some got antibiotics. The worst case definitely got antibiotics. And the WD-40 calves actually healed up as fast or faster than the calves that got antibiotics. And so we started just using WD-40, and it worked great in that scenario for us. And I ended up talking to a vet afterwards. He was a vet for multi-min, because we're working with them on this liver biopsy trial, because we mix up our own mineral. Because another issue that we're having was internal parasites in these weaned calves that we just could not get away from weaning our calves 2-3 times in the winter. And it just didn't, worming our calves 2-3 times in the winter, and it just didn't make sense. And so I heard Nicole Masters give a presentation, and she said, any cow that's ridden with internal parasites is deficient in copper, and anything that has external parasites, lice, is deficient in sulfur. And there's this mineral that you can mix up yourself that addresses both of those components. And so again, set up an experiment where our Wagyu calves were put on this deal called Copper Lick. And our other calves, our steer calves, this was the year they were on just a generic range mineral. The steer calves got pink eye. The Wagyu calves, and actually this is the second year of the experiment because their heifer calves were on the Copper Lick. Wagyu calves and heifer calves did not get pink eye. The only difference between the three groups was the mineral that they were on. And the multi-min vet that I was talking to, he said, in that scenario where it's mechanical, a scratch in the eye from, say, hay particles getting in, the reason that scratch is happening in the first place is because they're deficient in copper and zinc. And what copper and zinc do, that's like, if you picture a cell structure, the cellular wall, that nice rigid structure, is supported by copper and zinc. If they're deficient, it's like this soft, flimsy deal that scratches really easily. And so if they're deficient in copper and zinc and they get hay in their eye, scratches the eye, in your average bacteria that's everywhere, which is the bacteria we were dealing with, just gets sucked right into that scratch and latches into the scratch. And that's when the infection starts. And what that WD-40 did was it's a water displacer, so it flushes that bacteria out of the scratch, and it hangs out in that scratch long enough for those cells to regrow. That's, according to him, how and why it works. It did for us. It has for many other people. I don't know if it would work for viruses, probably not. So through that was one of quite a few experiences where I'm a huge believer in getting your mineral program right, even if it's fairly expensive. And since going with the copper lick, we've only had to deworm our calves once in 5 years, and we haven't poured anything for years, and our cows they'll get some lice, but not as much as they did when we were pouring them for lice.
I see this come up a couple times, so I'm just gonna also let people know we had a vaccine for that pink eye and took swabs, and it was a different variant of what we vaccinate for. And we had a vaccine made up of one that would cover both of the variants, but we couldn't get it made for a while, as I'm sure everybody's dealt with getting things done in a supply chain things. So that we got that in probably finally got it in him like 3 weeks ago, hoping that mitigates it, but so far hasn't much. We just took new swabs again last week and sent those in again, but I just see the vaccine and new variants popping up, so it was a different variant. Just throwing that out there.
I'm just going to ask Bryan, so this multi-min, which we're debating whether we would use this or not, and based on what Cooper just said, Cooper, if he just vaccinated with multi-min and actually addressed what you think could be a copper, zinc, or whatever deficiency, how quickly would that, I don't know how expensive, I don't think it's that expensive, but what if you just vaccinated with multi-min and did a quick test?
And I know you addressed this to Bryan, Bill, but I just want to be clear. I just happened to be talking with the multi-min vet. We weren't using multi-min. I'm not endorsing multi-min. We were doing liver biopsies, and he wanted the information from our biopsies, and so he paid for the multi-min, paid for that, the biopsies to be done. I do think the WD-40 would probably, there's no way that would work if you're dealing with an actual virus. I think it only works if you're dealing with a bacteria because of scratching.
I can confirm that.
Can't wait till you solve the problem and tell us how you did it.